Welcome, everybody, to our very first LGB Alliance Canada YouTube chat. We're hoping to make this a regular series, but this is our very first, and we're really excited to be bringing this to you. And it's been a very exciting time across Canada with really exciting news about the rights of LGB Canadians across the country. And, of course, in particular, the gender mess that we've all found ourselves struggling with. So let's just have some brief introductions. My name's Artie Morty. I'm coming at you today from Toronto. Scotty, go ahead.
I'm Scotty. I'm coming to you from the West Coast, Vancouver Island, British Columbia.
Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm a therapist and coach in private practice in Alberta.
It's great to have you. We are coming up on almost 3 years with LGB Alliance Canada as an entity that's been fighting for the rights of LGB Canadians, that's lesbian, gay, and bisexual, same-sex attracted Canadians. And Michelle and Scotty, you've both been involved with the organization for some time. Where should we begin talking about the news that's been affecting Canadians specifically? Now, there's a lot that's out there on YouTube. There's a lot that's on social media about the gender mess. I assume if you're tuning into this, you know a little bit about what's going on. But we wanted to take some time to focus on what's going on in Canada specifically and to make this a kind of regular space where we could really put a spotlight on the Canadian angle of the great gender mess, because there's so many amazing people in Canada who are involved in this. There are so many developments that impact Canada. Canada is one of the most important fronts in the battle for same-sex attracted people's rights. Take it away, somebody.
Yeah, I would really agree that there's been a few things happen recently that have really brought the conversation forward. And I would say the number one thing recently has been Danielle Smith's policies, and then of course around the same time the WPATH and the CAS review being released, and we're seeing for the first time ever the conversation being allowed to happen in society and even amongst our politicians.
That's so true. That's so much. So we're going to have to take some time to get into each one of those individual things because they're so big, and even describing to the viewer what they are, give them some background if they don't know who Danielle Smith is, what WPATH is, what the CAS review is. We'll get into that.
Yeah.
And we have a guest that's going to be joining us shortly, Aaron, who is in Manitoba, I believe. But before we bring our guest on, let's hear a little bit about what's going on in Alberta, Michelle, where you are.
Yeah. So Danielle Smith, our premier, announced some policies that the government of Alberta was going to be introducing in terms of transgender health. And she met with a lot of stakeholders, and she met, I believe, with transgender individuals, lesbian, gay, adults, parents, and basically the key points that I think we can support, obviously, is the transgender identified individuals need to be treated with respect and dignity, and it should have protections under the law. I think, interestingly, she's going to be looking to recruit surgeons to assist transgender adults in Alberta with access to surgery and access to follow up if there are complications or whatever they need at home, rather than, I think right now most people go to Montreal, or sometimes they might go down to the States. The part of her policies that have really come under fire is stuff around pediatric transition. And she's taken a really calm and measured approach and is looking to follow the evidence. And as exemplified by the CAS review, which is the largest to date systematic review on the evidence base for pediatric transition, the evidence is limited, and the evidence that is there is weak, primarily, maybe moderate. And essentially, we don't really know the impacts in terms of long-term health consequences, psychosocial development, and if if pediatric transition is actually helping these kids. You know, they're kids and they're distressed and they need understanding and support. And that understanding and support within the medical and mental health field really needs to take into account their developmental stage. And sort of by definition, they have not solidified an identity. And for us to concretize that when they're supposed to be exploring, so high exploration, low commitment, that's what we want to see. And so she's brought in policies that basically will put those things into place, including some family support as well for children who are gender distressed or gender questioning. Yeah, so it's pretty exciting. And I think a lot of her policies really align with the recommendations that Dr. Hilary Cass has provided in the Cass Review after her 4-year deep dive into pediatric gender. So that's what's going on in Alberta. And it's, I think for people who are concerned about confused children or distressed children or children who are likely to grow up to be LGB, this is really great news in Canada. And
it is, yeah.
It's been a long time coming.
It's really interesting, as is always the case, whenever there is a piece of news about the gender situation or whatever we want to call it, there are always two stories. There's the story of the thing itself, and then there's the story of how it's being discussed and disseminated in the media. There's the kind of meta story. So it's really interesting because Danielle Smith is, of course, a conservative. Alberta is generally a little bit more of a conservative province than, say, Ontario or British Columbia. So there's this kind of among many factions in the media and on the center-left spectrum of politics, it will be assumed that whatever her policies are, they're going to try to spin them as very anti-LGB, as anti-gay, as traditionally hostile to same-sex attracted people. But as we've seen, you've just given us an amazing summary of her policy with regard to gender and pediatrics, and it's completely in line with the world standards, the highest levels of scientific research that's available, the highest quality scientific studies that have been available. It's all in line with that. It's very much in line. It's a very professional, responsible approach. And it even increases funding for people with gender dysphoria who have transgender identities. So it's so strange, but you're not seeing that reflected in the media, are we? If you turn on so much of the Canadian news, Scotty, I can see you laughing like it's not happening. Yeah, like what do you think, Scotty, of how it's been disseminated in the media? Have you seen any of the CBC's coverage or anything, or Global News?
I mean, yeah, a little bit of that, and they really double down on the affirmation model. But I really appreciate, I think Danielle Smith recently wrote in the National Post, was it? Has anyone read that? And she actually addressed the internalized homophobia driving some of this gender affirmation care, which is remarkable.
She wrote a piece in the Post.
I believe so, yeah.
Oh, that's great to hear. That's good that there's fight back. And it's of course it's in the Post too. We're not seeing the CBC, we're not seeing Global News, we're not seeing CTV, we're not seeing these news outlets covering this story the way that it should be. It's really quite frustrating.
And it's being covered, sorry to interrupt, but it's being covered by sort of centrist, left of center media outlets in the UK, like The Guardian, and in the US. I haven't finished listening to it yet, but I was listening to the On Point interview on NPR with Dr. Hilary Cass. And I really couldn't believe it. It was balanced and non-hysterical and no hyperbole and actually just genuine good faith questions and answers and discussion. And sadly, in Canada, I don't really think outside of the usual suspects, which is basically in terms of larger media outlets, I think is National Post. We haven't, have you seen anything?
One piece in the Globe and Mail that was a dipping of a toe in the waters, so to speak. It was very much, even to get NPR to finally smarten up and start covering this with more balance is a great, great success. To see The Guardian starting to smarten up and take this issue seriously and stop treating it like a political a political bullet to throw at their opponents on the right of the spectrum, because this is not a political issue. This is a medical and scientific issue. But I digress. We're seeing Canada still far behind other countries when it comes to this issue, other countries in the Western English-speaking world. The United Kingdom, of course, is so far ahead of Canada. There is so much going on there. And the United States is starting to get caught up rather quickly, although it's in a really strange state because, of course, it's an election year south of the border. But it's probably an election year up here, too. Any bets on what we think the next non-National Post outlet will be to actually start dipping their toes into covering this?
It's going to take a lawsuit. It's going to take a lawsuit, I think, or a few of them, and then they'll start reporting.
That's a very good point. Yeah. And there are, of course, people in Canada who I don't think all of them are public.
What kind of lawsuit do you mean, Scotty?
I mean, detransitioner and gender harms lawsuits, I think, are going to be what it takes for the media to start reporting them.
Of course, we have one.
Yes.
That's ongoing. Michelle Aleva at Some Nuance, please, I think is her Twitter and Substack. She does great pieces. Yeah, maybe more lawsuits, or maybe a change in federal government. Like there's a climate of fear that exists in Canada that I don't think exists in the States because of the First Amendment, and doesn't exist in the UK, I think maybe because they have had a conservative government of late, and they've also been organized for a lot longer than we have. But I think one of the things that holds people back in Canada is fear. And rightfully so. I mean, look at what's going on with Amy Ham. Look what's happened with Jordan Peterson. Look what happened with Chanel in Ontario. So, Canada is it's a risky place to speak openly about your views, because if they go against the orthodoxy, they're really not welcomed, and you're quick to be vilified. So.
Oh, God. And I know that all three of us have faced repercussions for our views, and so has our guest. And maybe now is a good time to bring our guest in to join the chat. We have the wonderful Erin Kimberly. Erin, are you ready to come on stage? Great. Okay, let's bring Erin on. Hi.
Hey, guys.
It's great to see you, Erin.
Nice to
Thanks
see
for
you.
joining us.
I'm not able to see Scotty for some reason. His screen is all, on my end, it's all pixelated, but
nice. Does that help?
No.
Any better?
No, but that's okay. I can still talk to you, Scotty.
All right.
Okay, I put myself on the bottom. Give us a brief introduction. Many people know who you are because you're all over the airwaves, so to speak. You are someone with your hands in a lot of things. But give us a brief introduction for the one person out there who doesn't know who you are.
Sure. So I'm Erin Kimberly. And now I trip over my words here because, I grew up, I was a butch lesbian. I medicalized, identified as a trans man for many years. In the public conversation, I've gone back to calling myself a butch lesbian for various reasons. I'm also a registered nurse with a specialization in mental health. And it's through the work that I was doing that I became concerned about various issues regarding gender identity and how the medical system is handling so-called trans kids. So it was in late 2020 that came onto my radar as a concern, and it's been one rabbit hole after another since then.
Well, and you having had medical transition and having identified as a trans man for at least a decade. How long were you identifying as a trans man?
Almost 20 years.
2 decades almost. Wow. So you've seen the changes very firsthand, I can imagine.
Very much so. In terms of medical practices and also just our thinking about all of this and the meaning of what gender dysphoria or when I went through the system, it was called gender identity disorder. Amongst the butch lesbians that I knew, that was something that seemed fairly common. a fairly common gay and lesbian experience, and the thinking about what that means has completely changed over the years. And I wasn't part of that change. I was just off living my life, and it was through the clinical work that I started to engage with that community and realizing, okay, they're talking this language that I'm not understanding.
Yeah, it is
It was-
interesting. Sorry, go
It
ahead.
was
Michelle, yeah.
removed from, oh, sorry, Artie. I just wanted to say to Aaron to speak, to sort of piggyback on your point. I think that somewhere around 2015, 2014 is when I noticed things sort of gaining speed and a shift from a more evidence or empirical or reality-based view of gender dysphoria and transition, and the things that go into supporting someone in transition to ameliorate whatever level of distress they're having. And I think that sometimes people still think that that's what's happening. Like, oh, it takes a long time. You've got to live as the other gender, whatever, for 2 years, or there's all these assessments. And I was working at a trans wellness clinic in 2014. And that was when I first started noticing just little things that struck me sort of differently than what I had seen before. And it was a long process to sort of put it all together in my own head, because it's kind of a complex issue. But there was a movement away from any sort of medical safeguarding, which is called derisively gatekeeping. But that medical safeguarding or quality care based on evidence seem to have been abandoned for people who are struggling with gender or have a trans identity.
Yeah, and I wasn't a part of the care prior to around 2019, so I hadn't seen that shift and that change. So when I encountered it, it hit me like a wrecking ball, because I hadn't been part. It wasn't a gradual change for me. It was stepping back into this space, and it became an accidental activist because I was walking into that space with the understanding of gender dysphoria that I had 20 years ago, and not realizing that I was pissing everyone off in the room because they had long moved on from that way of thinking, and weren't the least bit gracious about bringing me along to their way of thinking and explaining, oh, we don't think that way anymore, and this is why. It was just this accusation that I was somehow bigoted.
Well, it's very hard. You're talking about changing attitudes, but there's also a very different changing social world we're living in. Identities are relationships between an individual and their society and their culture. That's what an identity is. It's the interface between who you are and how you fit into the environment you're in and the culture you're in. And different cultures in different times and on different continents have vastly different kinds of identities. So the concept of gender dysphoria, the concept of distress and disorder about one's identity with relation to their gender expression, and their sex related to society, it seems it's impossible to measure it without having a sort of static background against which to measure it. When we're talking about kids with dysphoria, kids with distress about their identity, if we're trying to diagnose a future pathway that's going to be better for them, we can only do so if the society they're going to be in has some static set rules that we can expect will be the same if they grow up. So you know what I mean? Like if you're a very, very, very hyper feminine boy, and it's not easy being a hyper feminine boy today, right now in society, then you might say that's going to be the case 10 years from now. They're still going to have a hard time being a feminine boy because society won't have changed. So you will change the boy. You give them some treatment. But we're living in a hyper accelerated age where the culture and the society is rapidly, rapidly transforming. So it's utterly impossible to try to predict how somebody is going to feel about their identity in the long term, in the medium term, in the very, very short term. Even from when COVID happened until today, the concept of transgender has transformed radically. And like you both say in your clinical work and in your lives, the concept of transgender has transformed radically. So how can we possibly know with children whether they're going to be better off, as in psychologically having a better outlook with a transgender identity than without one, especially considering these decisions are irreversible once we get medicine involved. And that's setting aside everything to do with the medical side effects and the medical procedures themselves, which come with great risk. So to me, I get frustrated sometimes because the concept at the very core of medical treatment, it almost doesn't make, it does make sense, but it doesn't make sense in the sense that we're trying to predict the future of culture, and that's not possible. I'll give you an example of other cultures, in which case, you know, like on the island of Samoa, we have the third gender subculture of the Fa'afafina, and that's been around for, it's been a sort of stable identity for at least a century. It's been very stable. If you were a very, very, very feminine boy from early childhood, you would be recognized as behaviorally distinct from the other boys and a very, very hyper feminine. And then you would be put on a social track. You would be socialized to not, you wouldn't be sort of subtly taught to masculinize your behavior, as boys typically are as they grow up. You would be taught to embrace your feminine side and to teach yourself to be more feminine instead of to be like the other boys, and to wear in more feminine typical clothing, and clothing that's more or less the same as what women wear in society. No one assumes you're female. Everybody knows you're male, but you're raised to wear women's clothes or feminine clothes, and you're raised in this sort of this separate role in society and in culture. And they've generally been very happy. There's been very little mental distress among these people. I have my own issues because their life choices are limited. These feminine boys who get raised in the Fa'afafina third gender, almost analogous to a transgender kind of role, I say that I see that their lives aren't as fulfilling and fulfilled as other people in society. But nevertheless, all of that suddenly stops working because the internet has come to the island of Samoa. All of these fa'afafinas, these very feminine boys who become feminine men, are all of them gay. And now they've got Grindr on their phones. And now they're saying, wait a minute, I don't want to be a feminine man anymore. Now that I know that the option is available to me to dress like a typical man and to not play the part of this sort of third gender category, it's a bit, you can't unscramble that egg. Once that information becomes available to these people, they don't want to go back. You can't, once you learn that you're allowed to be an out homosexual male and express yourself femininely or masculinely, but you don't have to segregate yourself into a separate category, people start to want that. And that's happened very quickly. It's just in a matter of years. So even out in these cultures that have third genders that are analogous to transgender, the internet and the social media age is just utterly transforming how these societies work. And that's just like what's happening in our society, but in the other direction. We're trying to bring transgender into our culture, but I don't think in the long term it's going to work out so well. Sorry, that was a long rant. What do we have to say? Sorry, let someone else speak.
Well, that's a really been, yeah, you make important points, and that's a part of the conversation that's been lost in the whole transgender conversation, isn't it? Is when did we abandon the idea that we can make the world more civil to gender nonconforming homosexuals? And that's been, I think, the unfortunate outcome of the whole trans train, is any gay or lesbian that's at least bit gender nonconforming ends up getting on that train and medicalizing, and we've abandoned that conversation. Well, maybe we could have actually made our lives better as just gender nonconforming people.
Yeah, there was a quote from Dr. Hilary Cass. She said that she had interacted with a patient who is a trans woman now, as a male with a transgender identity, who had undergone the very earliest protocol, so who had had puberty blockers and everything from a very early age. And, you know, per Cass's words, passes well. But this person now in their young adulthood recognizes that they were actually a gay, feminine gay male, feminine gay boy who was just struggling with severe internalized homophobia. And now there's a kind of question of, that's not quite regret, but it's a sense of like, this path that I've gone on, there's no going back. I have to make the best of it, but it may not have been the optimal life path for me. There's going to be a lot of that,
yeah.
I think.
And that's one of the things that actually really infuriated me as a clinician when you see these, I mean, it was mostly lesbians that I saw in my practice. I didn't see a single gay man. And So some of those kids clearly fit what I now know is the ROGD profile, but there were some that had been the classic gender dysphoria early onset. They were lesbian girls who were gender nonconforming. They had a sense of incongruence. And I didn't feel like I was even at liberty to talk to them about the fact that that's a really common gay and lesbian experience. And to talk about that from a homosexual framework rather than just affirming them as, yep, you're the opposite sex, or you're trans.
Mm-hmm.
And that frustrated me so much that I didn't feel like I could, as a licensed healthcare professional, just speak freely and common sense and factually with these kids.
Yeah, it's a really common thing to be, if you're a young person, if you're a gay adult or a bisexual adult or lesbian adult, it's very likely that you had some amount, if not even a lot, of gender nonconformity in your childhood. And it may have even reached the point of distress, and it may have even reached the point of some degree of medical involvement in your life due to your distress. There's this attitude among LGB people that trans people are other. The trans kids are them over there, and we are the gays over here. And once a child is labeled as a trans kid, they're outside of our sense of empathy. They have this different thing going on in their heads that we aren't allowed to investigate and try to empathize with and try to see if they were like us when we were kids. Once you put a different label on these kids, you're saying that they're in a different psyche, and it's not your place to say so. But that's not true. I'd like any LGB person who's watching right now to understand that trans comes from the kinds of distresses that are extremely common among LGB people. These people are going through very typical LGB experiences, and they often get diverted onto the trans pathway. Scotty, you were gender nonconforming as a kid, weren't you?
Oh, I absolutely was. I remember it. I remember loving to play with my mom's makeup and do sort of more typical female-oriented things with my grandmother. We had a really strong bond, and my mother, who later turned very evangelist, didn't like that at all. I was quite shamed for the way I would even run or talk, constantly corrected. So the idea of typical gender was oppressive to me, and it was being able to let go of that and knowing that I could be a man in any way I wanted that was healthy. And that didn't take, it took till I was like 40-ish, right, to be able to accept all that. Now we're affirming kids and these fleeting senses of identity. It takes a long time for adults to work out their own feelings around their sexuality, depending on the family context they come from and their own culture. So it's a great disservice. Like going back in my baby book, my mother had scrolled out all of these notes, but if you take a magnifying glass and go up there, you can read it. And a lot of it was about my nonconformity, and I guess it was cute when I was 3, but when I was getting into her Mary Kay kit at 14, she didn't like that and erased it all.
Michelle, did you have gender nonconformity in your childhood?
I don't know that I thought about it a lot. I was very sporty and aggressive, and very physical. So a little bit that way, and bold was something I was often accused of being. In my teen years, especially, and my early 20s, I was pretty gender nonconforming and really not interested in being considered. I mean, I was a female and a woman. It never occurred to me that I wasn't. I didn't have that. But I was pretty disappointed with that outcome. I think I thought I would have preferred to have been a man, and a lot of it was just around social expectations. And I didn't like what, people expected of me. Did they expect it of me? I'm not really sure. Was it all in my head? Probably a little bit of both. But, I was like shaving my head and running around in men's clothes I found on the back lane. Like, I think if someone had suggested to me that I was non-binary, or I could have been male, and that coupled with a strong sense of belonging and purpose and understanding of myself in a new way, I think I could have been pretty attracted to that entire thing. But it just wasn't in the air when I was a kid growing up, and that I knew of anyway. I think one of the things we're all talking about is this idea of an open future. And, it's a sort of philosophical concept about what do we owe children and do we owe them an open future? And Danielle Smith alluded to that, and I think the CAS report does as well. And this is what I'm hearing from you guys, like, if you're a really feminine little boy, I have met very manly men, gay manly men, who were also very feminine little boys and then grew up when they're, I don't know, bears or like very masculine presenting. And it sounds like in Samoa, what I'm understanding from you, Artie, is that sort of traditional placement of feminine men and boys and turning them necessarily into very feminine presenting women, whatever I'm trying to say, like feminine presenting, does them a disservice. And also now that they can see that they can be something else, they want to be that something else. And I think the idea that the LGB, that the T is about something else, that trans exceptionalism is not doing anything for our young people, because I think the studies are pretty clear. The 11 that I'm more familiar with, and I think there's really only been one other one on kids with gender dysphoria, is that most of them desist through the process of puberty, which we're now blocking. So we're blocking them from the thing that's going to help them become comfortable with who they are and in their own skin. And I think the majority desist, and most of those kids grow up to be LGB. So there is an intimate tie between those two. And to concretize, as you noted, fleeting senses of self with children and young people, I mean, identity goes over the lifespan for the reasons you noted, Artie, and it's particularly fluid, tweens, teens to like 25, and to concretize people and to put them on a medical pathway that has a heavy, heavy burden on the body and involves surgeries. And if anybody's ever had surgery, you're never the same after surgery. Can be very serious complications and even just minor irritating ones. But you're robbing those kids of an open future, of making that decision as an adult. Do I want to remain gender nonconforming? Is that still who I am? Who am I? How do I want to live? And I don't think we're giving kids that choice. We're taking it from them.
It's also the narrative correction, though, because, if families brought a kid in who was same-sex attracted and had all those classic signs of childhood incongruence, and you have this family and this young person in front of you, they're not being told, well, are you aware of the fact that sense of incongruence is really common for pre-gay lesbian kids? Mm-hmm. So let's wait it out. Let's see where your sexuality lands. That's not the information they're being given, right? They're being clinicians are just affirming, yes, you are trans, and people are going to make very different decisions depending on what information they're given.
Yeah, and then how are people making how are they giving informed consent if they're not informed about what's going on? I mean, the dysphoria may desist. There are other aspects of their identity that need to be consolidated and to create some sort of narrative for themselves. But additionally, no one's really clear about what being trans is. And no one also talks about the idea that some people continue to struggle with dysphoria or some sort of sense of alienation from their bodies. And they don't transition and they don't see themselves as trans. And that's just not part of their identity and their self-identity. And I don't think that that's being told to kids that, maybe you do have dysphoria. Maybe that is the way your suffering manifests in your life and you're going to have to figure it out. And because there's no guarantees, we also know that transition will ameliorate that. And we don't know. So we don't know who's going to persist, who's going to desist, and who it's going to help. So, yeah, it must have been hard.
I understand why the LGB is distancing itself from the T. I mean, that it makes sense to me in terms of how all this is playing out. And the vast majority of people under that T banner aren't of the LGB cohort. So part of the work that I'm trying to do is to pull apart, sort of take that lid off the box of trans, the big T of trans, so that we can begin to talk about all those different cohorts. But I agree that I would really like to see the LGB embrace that the homosexual cohort, to embrace that, to better understand it so that we can take care of our own LGB kids.
Yeah. Well, it seems like the only way we can really do that is by emphasizing their same-sex attraction first and foremost, and their trans identity secondarily to their same-sex attraction. They're still trans, but they're gay people who have trans identities, rather than trans people who are biologically gay. Scotty, sorry, you were trying to say something.
Yeah, I was taken, like, we're talking a lot about the kids and open futures, and when I speak of that, I would also include the category of 17 to 25, and I think Hillary Cass did make a mention of that, of having a more, what did she call it, a holistic approach. And I know that, well, I'm quite happy that Danielle Smith and her have chatted, because maybe when they revisit how they're going to implement these policies, they will consider having that more holistic approach, because I think a lot of our young people, like, just stopping this train at 18, like, they need a lot of help. There's a lot of vulnerable kids, a lot of traumatized kids out there who have comorbidities, and that just doesn't work out at 18. No. So it makes me hopeful that there's some more help for these gender non-conforming youth that look just like me.
And I think we have to shift the language. So much of how we position ourselves in the world is learning to use the right language. You don't want to say the wrong thing. You don't want to do the wrong thing. And a lot of the language that's being pushed by activists around transgender is very limiting. It's almost designed to limit people in their ability to make open decisions. If you're telling children that you don't choose to undertake a transgender identity, that you discover that you were trans, that automatically shuts the door on the possibility that you might have other possible futures available to you. And that's just one example of the ways in which the activist pushed language limits the availability of choices and the pathways available to young people. And it also signals to people that anyone who doesn't use that language is an outsider. This is a very deep psychological thing that humans have. We call them shibboleths. If you speak the wrong language, if you use the terms that aren't approved within your political social group, then you are going to be marked as somebody who's dangerous, somebody who's an outsider, who has ulterior motives that aren't in line with the people that you love. If somebody, called some, and gay rights was filled with a lot of language. Like, you couldn't call someone a homo. You had to call them gay. There were words you were not allowed to use. There were ways to discuss same-sex attraction and gay rights. The word homophobia it's a very political word, very politicized, because it's not an accurate word. Not all anti-gay discrimination comes from phobia. That's a political, rhetorical device that gay rights activists have used to great success. It was very useful for us, but of course, it was not 100% accurate. And the fact that it was inaccurate is now coming back to bite us in the ass. But my point is, the language policing around this is really, really difficult, and we have to work on it. We have to show people that it's not, well, there's that word, it's transphobia. It's not transphobic to acknowledge that some people ought to move into a transgender identity and to go along that pathway, and other people ought not to. For just one example, referring to people as the biological sex that they are instead of policing around sex, And that's not even to get into the pronoun debate, which is its own entirely separate can of worms. What can we do to show people who want to do good by trans people, want to do good by gender nonconforming people, and want to do good by gay people, to show them that it's not bigoted to refer to a trans person, a trans woman, as a trans identifying male, to discuss transgender as an identity and not an innate essence? What kinds of things can we do to help those people understand that it's actually empathetic and beneficial to people to keep this language open, so that people can always choose to come in and out of their identities when they need to?
Well, that's it. I mean, that idea is really at odds with, I think, the expectations set up by the clinical system, though. It's it's not like the clinical system and policymakers sat down to figure all of this out before they started medicalizing all of us, right? Like so you walk into a gender clinic, they transition you, and you're kind of offered this expectation that, okay, I get to live as the opposite sex now. We're granted, and it's not even discussed as a legal fiction. I think that's how it should be understood. And it should be written into policy as a legal fiction with limits in consideration of our biological sex. But that's never part of that process. We're just handed hormones and thrown out into the world to figure all this out. And now policymakers are scrambling to figure it out in policy. And I think we can't let the medical system off the hook for that, for offering vulnerable patients a kind of a promise of how they get to leave that office and move through the world when reality isn't really stacked.
Yeah, and it seems like everybody's passing that buck. You know, the endocrinologist isn't the one who's going to sit the patient down and say, sex doesn't literally change. This is just supposed to help your mental health in the short term and maybe the long term. You know, the surgeon isn't sitting you down and saying, oh, by the way, before I perform this operation, you need to know that your sex doesn't literally change, and this is just supposed to ameliorate your mental health. Although apparently they do actually sign a form. My friend who opted to undergo a vaginoplasty, who was very realistic about the limitations of such a surgery, and who was very realistic about biological sex. This is a gay male who is absolutely open that he's a gay male, but has had persistent gender dysphoria for a long time and has opted to undergo a vaginoplasty. And that is a responsible adult decision from somebody who spent years making that decision. So I'm fine with it, of course. And this person seems happy in their decision. But they were talking about how when this person was signing the forms to undergo the vaginoplasty, in the paperwork was, this does not change your sex. This will not change your sex at all. We will be performing procedures on the cosmetic appearance of your penis and of your testicles. We will not be turning you into a woman. You have to sign here and acknowledge that. There needs to be more of that, because there is a passing of the buck.
How long ago was that, Artie?
How can we this was just last year.
Okay.
This was a year ago.
People are still doing that.
Do you know what clinic that was at?
It was in the
that in
UK,
Montreal?
and I don't want to out this person.
Oh, okay. But it wasn't.
Wasn't in Canada, no. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because I was going to say the UK, I think, the NHS has some new directives around language, and I think, you know, it's easier there because it's all centralized. But in terms of what people can do and issues around language and the clinical piece, is part of it is somehow it's all being sort of captured by a particular political ideology with some magical thinking and a fear of clear definitions or consistent definitions of gender and sex and trans and being trans and all those things. And so it makes, like, clinicians can't talk about it, or doctors are afraid to talk about it. And then when we throw in Bill C-16 and we throw in Bill C-4, it's just a soup of fear and a lack of education, because a lot of the places in Canada that are trans clinics and experts are all, and I mean, Aaron, maybe you guys know, or Scotty or Artie, I think they're mostly based on WPATH. And WPATH, well, you know,
WPATH is a
problems.
Yeah, so the WPATH, can I just pause for a second to fill in a few details for those people who are just getting caught up? Bills C-4 and C-16. Bill C-4 was the so-called conversion therapy ban, which was no such thing. It enacted a ban on gay conversion therapy, but the meat of the bill was to ban alternative forms of treatment besides giving people sex changes. Anyone who states that they feel that they are trans in any way was limited to explore any other options. It was the railroad bill. It was the railroading you onto sex changes bill that was disguised as the conversion therapy bill. And what was 16 again? C-16 was a self-ID adjacent bill. Is that right?
Yeah,
Amendment to the criminal code.
Jody Wilson Rayburn, or Raybould, or whatever her name is, introduced that bill
Okay.
back in
self-ID.
2016 or 2015. I can't remember.
Yeah, I remember
2016.
Megan Murphy was doing a lot of work to highlight the issues around that bill. And I was working at a gay bar, and not paying attention to the problems yet. I was aware of them, but I wasn't looking at the legislation or anything. I was in the gay bubble. I was in the rainbow echo chamber at that point.
When I entered
and then
the scene,
there's the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which we'll get to. Sorry, go ahead, Aaron. Yeah.
I was just going to say, when I entered the scene, it was during the debates around the conversion therapy bill. And I was part of groups that were lobbying to have the wording of that changed. And we were successful. I just want to make people clear that we were successful in introducing 2 clauses to that, so exceptions. So it does still allow for assessment prior to any medicalization. And it does allow for exploratory psychotherapy to explore your identity development. So anyone saying that psychotherapy as an exploration of someone's identity development is conversion therapy, that's absolutely incorrect, and that is not what our law says.
That's a very, very good point. But the law is still scary enough that it's probably functioning to discourage a lot of therapists who
can we link those? Can we link those amendments in our comments? Because I'm very curious about them.
And the one thing I'd add, though, with the clauses that were added through the efforts of Aaron and other people in Canada is that the clause allows for exploration in the service of identity development, but it's not necessary. So what that means is that different professional associations and colleges can have their own policies and standards of care around working with gender questioning or dysphoric children or adults, and they can remove that clause. They don't have to have it in there. So that essentially means, even though the government of Canada does allow for that in psychotherapy or in healthcare settings, your particular college may forbid you from engaging in that sort of work.
Well, that was part of the lobby efforts that happened after, because I know that Florence Ashley, for example, was very involved in the drafting of the conversion therapy bill, who's written extensively about how any psychotherapy is conversion therapy, and publicly expressed that they were very disappointed with the outcome of the conversion therapy bill, that didn't go far enough, in their opinion. And so the lobby effort now have shifted to our regulators and the provinces to try to bypass our federal legislation because they didn't get what they wanted, and now going after our regulatory bodies to write a definition that's more strict.
Now, this is important. This is not to give people who want to pursue transgender medicine the right to do so. They're trying to lock out other people's rights. We are not trying to help trans people live their full lives. They are trying to limit the possibilities that some people who are in distress might walk away from the transgender club. This is all of this seems to be designed to shut out all the doors. People who dabble, people who think I might be trans, they want to lock all the doors so that you just keep going until you get a sex change. And I know that's very blunt talk, but that's what's happening. And I'm not going to mince my words. It's infuriating. These people are trying to shut down other people's rights and possibilities. And the language is designed for that too. And I have no sympathy for Florence Ashley. Florence Ashley is a Canadian who is an activist who has walked far, far away from the realm of rational, reasonable behavior, no professionalism whatsoever, no sense of open debate with the other side. And I've had it, I've absolutely had it. Florence Ashley, let's talk about what happened at the World Health Organization. There was kind of an attempted, so the World Professional Association for Transgender Health is a kind of, it's an activist lobby group that models itself to look like one of these medical groups, like the American Psychological Association or the American Dental Association. All these medical fields have a kind of medical organization that usually kind of steers them in the right direction, and the transgender medicine world doesn't have one. So this organization called the Harry Benjamin Society cleverly decided to claim that territory and renamed themselves the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and have been sort of putting on their fake lab coats and their pretend stethoscopes and pretending to be a medical organization when they absolutely aren't. They're a lobby group. But they have been faced with a huge expose recently that the behaviors of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health are deeply unprofessional. People use words like cult-like and things like that. We don't necessarily need to get into the World Professional Association for Transgender Health now, but let's bear in mind that right now, activists who work around the World Professional Association for Transgender Health are under a very ugly spotlight, because there are some very, very ugly revelations emerging around these extremist activists. And in that atmosphere, Florence Ashley and a number of extremist activists got together and somehow got involved with the World Health Organization and had put together a committee that was going to try to get the World Health Organization to make some declarations about transgender health on the global medical level from the World Health Organization's perspective. Aaron, can you tell us a bit about what that committee was organized to do?
It was multi-part. It's my understanding that they were looking at the medical, but they're also looking at social policy and self-ID. So you're right.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of these things are coming from those very high levels of government and then being enforced upon countries and provinces.
Yeah.
Wasn't it kind of rushed? Like they released.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, the WHO, this whole thing, did they release like, oh, this is the board that we've put together to create these guidelines of care? I think it was like mid-December, like right before the holidays. And they're like, you have till January 3rd. I don't remember the dates, but it was a very limited time. And people in Canada scrambled because WHO board, or the group they put together, didn't even meet their own standards for creating guidelines. Like you have to have, I'm not a expert on this stuff, but you need to have people who are ideally not involved in that whatever area that they're looking to do policies around. And if that's not possible, then you want to try to have a balanced approach. And that was not the case. And so people did some work, and I think that suddenly Florence Ashley was not available anymore to work on that board, and some new people were added, and then they extended the date, right? Is that right?
Yeah.
I think, just so people know, like,
committee got together.
we can change things.
Yeah, they tried what they did. This was all under the cover of, they're trying to avoid scrutiny, they're trying to avoid detection, and they're trying to use clever tactics to shut doors, to deny people the possibility of not getting sex changes if they experience any kind of distress or confusion around their identity with regards to sex and gender. And this was a really, really terrible, unprofessional attempt to ram a massive policy through. Thank goodness the LGBT Courage Coalition, which Aaron, you are a part of, I'm involved with as well, but not at the level you are with that group, got together and brought a lot of attention to this. So did a lot of other groups. LGB Alliance Canada, we submitted a brief in protest at the rushed, hurried attempt to sneak an activist-loaded committee to ram their own agenda through and to make it official World Health Organization policy. Thankfully, the brakes were put on this. Florence Ashley was mysteriously removed from the panel. Formally, it was announced that Florence Ashley was not available, but it certainly has the appearance that Florence Ashley, being such an extremist and such an unprofessional activist, and so much scrutiny being put on this person, that everyone sort of felt that they had to remove this person from the panel. And it's my understanding that that panel has just gone completely silent. So not only did we succeed in slowing down this rushed process and in having some of the extremists on this panel removed for being really, really not professional, but it sounds like the whole thing has just quietly vanished. That was an attempt.
For those of you who might not be familiar with the inner workings of the mind of Florence Ashley, this person actually was out there saying and advocating that puberty be a choice for all children. Like, how wild is that?
That's the Matrix. It's not, humans aren't virtual avatars with body parts that we can put on and take off at will. Puberty isn't voluntary. We are mammals. Every single mammal on Earth goes through a period where they go from a juvenile to an adult, and it's called puberty, and it has a tremendous impact on all of our development, our mental development, our body development, our bone development. It's just such a fundamental part of the human experience, of the bodies and the minds that we're in. The idea that it can be optional is a fantasy in activists' minds that is just so disconnected from the reality of biology. We're getting into creationism territory. You know, like this is just kind of, it's very analogous to creationism, and it's just abject refusal to acknowledge that humans are mammals, that we're animals, and we have limits.
See, creationism, well, funny you bring that up. I find a lot of parallels between this movement and, let's say, maybe the lesser rational arm of evangelicalism. For example, if you were to have someone who is detransitioned, you would have someone like Florence Ashley, for example, who would probably say, I can't put words in their mouth, but that they weren't really trans. And I'd get that in church all the time. Oh, they weren't really Christians. So it's just this belief-based system. There's no measurement to tell if someone really is that thing or not. What a terrible reason to be cutting up kids.
It alienates also trans-identified persons. I mean, I know I've worked with trans-identified persons as clients and as colleagues who find it hard to get care that works for them, because when they go to typical gender clinics, it's all sort of full of this magical thinking, and it doesn't align with the way, you know, because they're sort of based in reality, and it's an unwelcoming space for them. And I do think that there are efforts being made to maybe not create that in that world. I'm not really sure, but I just wanted also, I think you brought them up, Scotty, and I think we'd like to talk about detransitioners. Like, if we're going to talk about what we can do, one of the things that I would like to see more of is information around trans regretters and detransitioners. And, you know, if you go to all the major gender clinics in Canada and do a search for regret or detransition, zero available information. And so, of course, we have Detransition Alliance Canada, started by our friend Kelly. And so, yeah, I just thought we'd bring that up, because I think that that's part of creating a space where people can talk more freely and people are going to be gentle. And I think the presumption of evil on the other's person is not helping us get anywhere. And I'm not exactly sure how to bridge those gaps. And Erin is doing work with LGBT Courage Coalition to do that. But I think that that goes sort of hand in hand with welcoming detransitioners and not dismissing them as you weren't really trans, and negating their reality is insignificant because there aren't enough of them, which is kind of rich coming from a population that is actually a pretty small population.
And also welcoming them back into the LGB if they are homosexuals. The reality is, I think we're going to have a lot of bearded lesbians around in the future, right? Or, you know, lesbians without breasts, and that's, I think that has the potential to be very socially awkward, and it's going to be a challenge, I think, for the LGB to grapple with that, to suddenly have people in lesbian spaces who still, I mean, this isn't reversible. I haven't taken testosterone now in very many months. Nothing is reversed. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, yes, I could shave my beard, but I'm not going to grow the hair on my head again. These are permanent changes. And so it's something that we need to start planning for and thinking about, is welcoming people back into our spaces whose bodies have been altered.
And it's very difficult because right now there's a sense among many gays and lesbians, and bisexuals, of course, too, always included in when we say gays and lesbians, we're not skipping the bi, feeling that their boundaries are being challenged by, like, lesbians are feeling that their boundaries are being challenged so much by males in their spaces. And gay men are feeling that their boundaries are being challenged by females with trans identities, self-identifying as gay men. We have this new situation that it was going to be arising with lesbians who are lesbians, biological females who are detransitioned, who are bearded lesbians who don't have breasts. And is there going to be a sense that because there had been so many males trying to impose themselves on lesbian spaces, is that going to make it that much harder for the females to come back? And the problem with males like right now, there's a lot of anger at young females with transgender identities trying to declare themselves to be gay men, and they're all over gay dating apps and sex apps and things. And a lot of the rhetoric is, if you don't have a dick, you're not a guy. But then there are detransitioned gay men who don't have penises anymore, who are trying to get back into the dating market. And I don't want to alienate them. So the primacy of sex, regarding with the sex being the deciding factor of whether you can qualify as a homosexual male or not, isn't necessarily contingent upon having a penis or even necessarily looking very, very male on first glance, because a lot of these biological males have undergone surgeries. I always get that sting of upset a little bit when I'm angry at a woman claiming to be a gay man. And I want to say, you don't have a penis, that's why we're not accepting you. But then I think about friends of mine who don't have penises who are trying to date, and it hurts so much. This is the future we're going to be facing. It's going to be very, very challenging. The numbers are big. A lot of people don't know how big the numbers are. This is not just some niche side issue that affects 2 or 3 people. There are 3,000 high schools in Canada, 3,000 at least, I think. I checked the number. And every single one of those high schools has like 20 children a year who are identifying as transgender and medicalizing. Do the math. This is massive. The number of people who will reach their mid-20s having undergone significant medical sex trait alterations. And with the shifts in our society happening, a lot of these people are going to abandon their transgender identities, or their transgender identities are going to be much more complicated, and they're going to come back to reckoning with the reality of their biological sex. And it's going to be very, very challenging for the gay community. All the more reason we have to stop using the fake language. It is not intolerant of trans people to refer to them as trans-identified males or females. It's not intolerant of transgender to acknowledge that it's a life decision and a life path, and it's not innate. It's not analogous to homosexuality in that way. Yeah. Scary what the future is going to hold. It's going to be very challenging. And it's a challenge that LGB Alliance Canada has to really prepare for, because these are our people, same-sex attracted people. I'm
aware of the time, but I do, maybe it can be food for thought for another episode or chat. But Erin, I'm curious around if you've noticed, I've certainly noticed that there's a presumption, and it's very deeply held, that by not using someone's preferred name and pronouns, that is necessarily an indication of a lack of love and respect. And I see this a lot in families and in younger people who are grappling with this. And, I think that presumption is doing a lot of damage to families, and it's sort of capitalizing on the discord that naturally occurs through the teen process of individuation and such. And also I think it sort of ties in, Artie, to what you're saying about how do we get out of this, how do we start using real language? But I think part of it is there is this deep belief around what it means to not use preferred names and pronouns. What's your experience of that being, and what are your thoughts on that?
I don't experience it very much, just because I do pass. So it is, I guess it is.
Oh, sorry. Yes. I also meant as a clinician.
As a clinician?
Yes, sorry. I mean, I am interested in.
I always have 2 hats on when I'm having these conversations, right? I never know which one to put on. As a clinician.
Both. I want to hear both.
So,
please.
I mean, it's a cultural narrative that's come from the trans community, right? That things like you're not supposed to trust cis people, you're not supposed to trust clinicians, you're supposed to disown your families if they're not supportive, and then the pronoun thing, right? That dead naming or the lack or pronoun use is this horrible, awful thing. I mean, I think for myself, I can always tell the intent when people are speaking to me. Like when someone is, I think any word can be a swear word if it's said with the right tone and the right intent. So people just referring to me by biological reality, I can pick up on whether that's just because they need to refer to the biological reality, or if people are doing that for the purpose of trying to be hurtful. So I think for myself, that's where I make the distinction. I mean, my old grandmother used words that were so outdated and people thought she was horribly racist, but you could tell that her intent, her heart was in the right place. Words are just words. I always try to look for the intent behind the words.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I sort of had these conversations in the 90s, I think, when a lot of this sort of language stuff was really starting to peak in the universities. But I guess I'm curious about your clinical experience, or I understand where you're coming from, and I am of a similar mindset, so there's that. But I do encounter people for whom, all things being equal, everything is fine in sort of whatever relationship that they may be discussing. But the name and pronoun comes up, and the distress, the real distress, and the real struggle they have with feeling rejected and unloved and disrespected because of pronoun or name use, which, by the way, from the other person's perspective, is not coming, if I'm going to, is not necessarily coming from a place of cruelty, and it is actually coming from their interpretation of demonstrating love and respect and care. And there's this real rub between those two perspectives. But I think that's part of what's going on. And I think it's the idea maybe is something like, which isn't helpful, by the way, but like, you can't reason your way out of something that you didn't reason your way into. I'm not really sure how to get that, but I just see it causing a lot of discord and distress, like adding to distress. They're already distressed about their gender incongruence, and then they have the gender dysphoria. In addition to that, then they're also somehow somebody, I don't know where it's coming from, is whispering that they're being disrespected and unloved and put in danger and being harmed if people don't use the right names and pronouns. And I'm not a language policing person. People should use what they want. And I'm not speaking about people being intentionally cruel or bullying or any of that. But there are people who want to use sex-based pronouns or name. Yeah. Anyway.
It seems to speak to, if you think of trans as like a veil or a bubble that we wear around ourselves, I think it speaks to what's hiding behind that veil. If you burst the bubble and all those feelings come up. I wonder if an analogy might be, when people are wanting to recover from addiction and they say, I can't stop, whatever substance they're using. I can't stop cocaine because stopping makes me feel anxious. And it takes some reframing. It's like, is it that stopping is causing that distress, or is the distress what your addiction was covering and protecting? But those are the questions those are the questions we're not allowed to ask in a therapeutic setting, right? Is what is all this stuff going on for you that somehow this new identity is holding and protecting? That bubble is being burst every time somebody uses a wrong pronoun and causing that distress. So is it that the use of a word is causing that distress, or is it like the addict that when they stop using the substance, it's that distress comes to the surface and is actually being felt and recognized?
Wow, that's profound, and it's interesting.
That is wonderful. Thank you.
It goes to show that a lot of people are being medicalized into transgender identities long before they have the right psychological mindset to be doing this. I have this belief, this sense that, like, if you don't know that biological sex doesn't literally change, if you don't have a proper grounding in what your sex organs do, what they're meant to do, what your sexual orientation is, and what the side effects are going to be like, and what other people's reactions to your appearance are going to be like. If you don't know exactly what this stuff is what the effects of sex change treatment are going to be, you are not ready to be undergoing it at all. This is so strange because people aren't being told the truth. And then you've got all these people who have already stepped forward into it. The sunk cost dilemma rears its ugly head. People who have already invested so much of their lives into transgender identities, who can't back out of them very easily, but who really shouldn't have undergone them yet because they didn't have the necessary exploration of what it is they were doing. And they're angry and they're aggressive and they're activists who are being, their behavior is unprofessional and sometimes unstable. And it's really, really difficult. Yeah, it's like, I believe in adults being free to make the decisions that they want to make for their bodies, as so long as those are informed decisions. And the informed part is very, very, there's a lot more work that I think should fall under the rubric of informed before people are able to make these decisions in a medical setting, you know?
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
And I also want to say, Michelle, I love your line. You said it before, and it's always stuck with me. It's like one of my favorite things I've ever heard, which is you can't reason someone out of something they didn't reason their way into. I use that in my mind almost every day now, and that comes from you. But we've been talking for a little over an hour now. We should probably start to wrap it up. But before we do, maybe we can briefly just talk about what's going on in Canada at the moment, some Canada-specific developments, and what's coming up. Especially you, Aaron, because I know that you are often involved in testimony with legal issues, and because you're an expert, yada yada, you know what I mean. I don't talk good sometimes. Tell us what's going on with you.
Well, there's two legal battles happening in Canada right now, more to come. Saskatchewan and New Brunswick are the first two. They implement policies limiting what schools can do in terms of socially transitioning minors without parental consent. They were very reasonable policies. They set the age at age 16, that anyone under the age of 16 could not be socially transitioned without parental involvement and consent. Anyone over 16, I think they probably set it at 16 because that is our Mature Minors Act, that in terms of medicine, mature minors can choose their own medical interventions without parental consent. So I think legally they probably had to set it at that number. But I thought they were very reasonable policies, but they're both being sued for discrimination for implementing those policies. I think Alberta will probably be the next one once they actually do. I know they've announced the policies, but they haven't, it's my understanding, they haven't implemented them yet. So there can't be a legal battle until it's actually implemented. So I hope one province at a time is where this pushback is going to happen.
On that note, I don't know. I don't know the details, but can anyone speak to the request for information out of Ontario right now around Scotty? Did you have a chance to look into that a little bit? Do you guys know what I'm talking about? No.
We got an email from someone about some proposed policies similar to what the WHO wanted to do in the province of Ontario. Like they wanted to put some local guidelines together. I was wondering if Aaron had that on recall.
Yeah, I remember that being announced, and I know that the document has been released for input. Yeah. But to be honest, I haven't looked very closely at it. I've just been so busy with these other legal battles, and I've got another legal battle that I've been involved in down in our neighbors to the south as well. So I've got 3 legal cases on the go right now. So I haven't been paying much attention to what's happening in Ontario.
I got the name here. I got the name here. Health Quality Ontario has put into draft an adult GAC guideline and is seeking input. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would
invite another one
people
from Employment Equity as well. So there are lots of organizations on the provincial and federal level throughout Canada, lots of government bodies that, because it's a bureaucratic everything, everybody is trying to tackle gender and implement it and integrate it into their systems. There's a consultation on the Ontario level with a body called Health Quality Ontario. And there's another consultation, which maybe we can talk about in our next episode, about the employment policy. Sorry, go ahead, Michelle. What were you saying?
I just was going to say that hopefully we could do a link in the description. But yeah, it was Health Quality Ontario, and they're looking to improve gender affirming care. And I haven't investigated it too closely, but the language seems a little
I've heard
Well,
it's-
starting with gender
From reality.
affirming care.
I've
Gender
heard it's not
affirming
very
care.
good. We were
Yeah.
hopeful, we met with the Minister of Health in Ontario, and he seemed to be on our side and understanding the issues. And that's when we first learned that they were putting together that committee. But it sounds like they stacked the committee with activists, which is what always happens, right?
reads
It's
like
so
that.
frustrating. I want to mention
because
too
people
that
think that
BC
only people who are really aggressive transgender activists are the only people who can speak to the transgender issue. But the transgender issue is really the gender and sex issue. So anybody who has a sex or a gender, which is anybody, this affects everybody. So people have to get it out of their heads that it's only this group that it's affecting. Because these policies don't, in fact, give extra rights to these people. They take rights away from everyone else, almost invariably. Yeah.
Well, even the trans people they line up, it's always that one cohort, right? It's not different cohorts with different ideas that are being invited. It's always the same bad ideas
Yeah,
that are being
that's something we
I
have
always
to
say
work on.
it's-
We need to get these people to stop taking the same extremists as though they're the spokespeople for all things to do with sex and gender. It's just not true. Yeah.
But before we lose the plot of what's happening in Canada, I did want to mention the policy in BC about sports as well to protect women's sports, but that was shot down.
Oh, was it?
It was.
What happened there?
Well, they had in BC here, they had the leader of the Conservative Party make a reading. It only lasted one reading, and it got voted down by the NDP and the Greens. But the BC Conservative and the United Party, which is formerly the BC Liberals, they voted for it.
So this was to make sure that sports were sex segregated. Is
Yes.
that right? And
Linda
a lot of
Blade.
people said they didn't want sports sex segregated, which is like
That's right.
beyond crazy.
And I believe Linda and April Hutchinson were both at the legislature, along with Gwen O'Mahony, who is a former BC NDP MLA from Chilliwack Hope. She's now running for the new Conservative riding in Nanaimo, Lanceville. So if you're a listener from that area, get out there and support Gwen.
We should ask Linda and Gwen to come on the show to talk about that development. That has an impact on LGB people. Absolutely. Yeah. Wow. What else is what's been going on in BC? We've heard well, we're all in different time zones, which is great, and we're all in different provinces. So this is it's a representative of how broad our country is. You can see that I'm already getting dark from where I am. I'm in
It's
Toronto.
hot here. It's about
Aaron,
26
you're in
above.
Winnipeg. Oh yeah.
Yep.
And Michelle, you're in Alberta. What's going on in British Columbia? There's always something going on in British Columbia.
Well,
And
we just
Scotty, you're
had
in BC.
that. We just had that happen. What Aaron was talking about, the attempt to pass some protecting women's sports laws, which was turned down. What else? Oh,
Wasn't
a
it
minor.
also couched?
Sorry.
David Ebby's response, the Premier's response, wasn't that also couched as anybody who tries to bring forth the idea that sports should be sex segregated or anything but women's and girls' rights? It was couched as being anti-trans.
I don't
too,
recall.
wasn't it?
But
Or no?
probably. I mean, at least by the BC activists who are freaking out over it. BC has really taken. We had that Recall Ratcheta campaign, which failed. They were trying to recall the education minister. But that didn't go through. There was a school trustee debate that involved a high-profile trans queer activist / drag king named Berkeley Volks. He went up against Emily Duggan from Mums Against the Norm. Unfortunately, Emily didn't win, but she raised a lot of conversation in the Kootenays over this issue, which was really great. And it happened at a fortuitous time with the release of the W Path and the Cass Review. So the bar is slowly getting raised. We're not where we are in Alberta, but I mean, we had a lot of activity here around the Parents' March. For me, that really solidified things. It really made a big separation between some of the far right and some of the LGB and trans people pushing back on this, because it was really quite nuts. Like, being in those marches, our unions were totally against us, and you had people on either side being hostile towards you if you were LGB. Yeah, things are percolating like that, sort of in small pockets all over this province. We had a minor perform at the Fountainhead Pub, the Junction, and Steamworks Brew. Gays Against Groomers picked up on that and did an expose on it last month. This person is like a underage, like under 15-year-old trans person who's doing quite sexually provocative material in these bars.
Mm-hmm. Redux also, I think, did a good expose on that. Yeah,
I heard about that. That's scandalous. This is a child in an adult entertainment venue performing very adult burlesque entertainment. You know, we have to understand that adults are allowed to have their burlesque entertainment spaces and their drag entertainment and their leather bars and all of that. But just because it doesn't win you any political points to try to take that and bring it into the sphere of children. That doesn't make any sense. That's not gay rights. You know, gay rights is we're allowed to have leather bars for adults. Gay rights isn't let's take them into schools for children. And same with drag and all of this stuff. It's there. It's fine as it is for consenting adults to do privately. There's no need to associate that with children or with the public sphere or to turn it into a culture war item. It's just crazy. Yeah. Well, on that note, we should probably wrap it up because we're over time. We've had so much to talk about on our first episode, and tonight's an interesting night because we might get a massive aurora borealis shower. Oh. So I'm hoping it's already getting dark where I am, and let's hope that as it gets darker in each of your respective provinces, you get a chance to go out and look up, and hopefully the clouds won't be too in the way, and you get to see some northern lights. I had never seen the northern lights.
I've only seen them once.
Oh yeah,
I've seen them once or twice, and they were not like the colors, just some green in the sky one evening. It was pretty wild still. Beautiful.
That's amazing. I mean, everyone in the UK on Twitter already, it's already dark in the UK. Everybody's posting their pictures of the northern lights all over Britain. So
it's a clear sky here today, so I'll have to check.
Be so exciting. A very appropriate day to celebrate the inaugural episode of LGB Alliance Canada's first chat. And what a great chat it's been. There's so much going on in Canada. It's so refreshing to just speak to Canadian voices about the gender mess. I can just feel a rush of greatness. So I'm going to go ahead and press stop for our viewers, but let's all stick around and have a little after party chat. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in.
Thanks.
Like and subscribe, and we'll talk soon. And sign up to our newsletter at LGB Alliance Canada, lgballiancecanada.com, I believe.
.ca.
.ca.
Bye.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye.